Hello, it's me. The horror of the Villisca Axe Murders. On June 10, 1912, George Kelly returned home from work to find his house in Missouri empty. He opened the front door with his own key and went inside to discover his wife and 6 of their children brutally murdered. When the sheriff arrived at the scene, he found that the bodies had been systematically mutilated, almost certainly after death. The first thing he noticed was the terrible smell. A reporter who later visited the scene would describe the stench as being that of a dead whale washed up on shore. Something he'd never encountered anything like it before or since. This was no ordinary murder. It was one of the most sadistic killings in American history. The Kelly family lived in the small town of Villisca, which at the time had only about 1,000 residents. George and his wife Catherine had bought the house just 2 years prior to the murders. It was an ordinary single-story farmhouse with a porch and white paint peeling off the window frames. Inside, there were 7 beds, each occupied by one of the Kelly children and their parents. When George discovered the body count, he called out for help and quickly made his way to the nearest neighbor, the Moore family. He told them what had happened and begged them to call the police while he ran home. As they all walked back to the Kelly residence together, Mr. Moore called out, "Is there anybody here?" There was no reply except for the wind blowing through the trees. But when they reached the house, they saw that the front door was wide open. Inside the house, George found his daughter Catherine lying in her bed completely naked, except for a pair of stockings. She had been beaten to death with an axe, but it was her mother and younger siblings who truly shocked him. Catherine's throat had been slit open from ear to ear. Her face was contorted in a silent scream. One hand was raised as if reaching for help. Her nightgown had been pulled over her head and her legs wide open, as if she had been violated. Little 4-year-old Stella lay next to her, both of her eyes gouged out and her head practically decapitated. But it got worse. In another bedroom, George found his 3 younger sons, ages 11, 9, and 7, along with their cousin, all hacked to pieces. Each of them had been struck multiple times with the blunt side of an axe. After making sure the others were dead, the murderer had ripped their clothes off. This wasn't the end of the bloodshed either. Down the hall, George discovered his 2 older boys, 13-year-old John and 10-year-old Walter, their skulls cracked like eggs.
Ow.
They had been killed in their beds, but the killer hadn't even bothered to take off their clothes. As if this wasn't bad enough, in the living room, George found the body of his 8-month-old baby lying in its crib. The child had been hit in the head with such force that part of the skull had been driven into the brain. All around the house, George could see blood, a lot of blood. The walls were covered in it, was on the beds, on the floor, dripping from the windows. The entire house looked as though it had turned into a slaughterhouse overnight. The local sheriff would later say it was impossible to imagine how the perpetrator could have moved around in such a confined space without getting stuck in the blood. Yet somehow they managed. What had happened here? Who would do such a thing and why? The authorities had no answers. To make matters worse, very few people had seen or heard anything unusual the night of the murders. One witness would recall hearing the sound of screams coming from the Kelly house at around 2:30 a.m., but nothing too loud or out of the ordinary, just someone yelling, "Oh God, oh God." Some neighbors also claimed to have heard what sounded like gunshots, but not many people took these reports seriously. What became known as the Axeman of Villisca had managed to get away, leaving behind a crime scene so gruesome that it horrified everyone. Within hours, the story had spread throughout southern Iowa, and hundreds of people were converging on the town, eager to catch a glimpse of the massacre for themselves. But before we continue, let us know in the comments below, what do you think happened to the Kelly family? And now back to our video. In the days following the murders, thousands of people would visit Villisca. By some accounts, as many as 20,000 people came to gawk at the crime scene. As you can imagine, the whole affair didn't do much for business. No one wanted to go anywhere near the house where the Kellys were murdered. It remained sealed off with yellow police tape until July, when the bodies were finally removed and the house was demolished. This day, no one is 100% certain what happened to the remains. The leading theory is that they were burned in an old stone furnace located near the property. One of the most interesting aspects of the case is that for a crime so vicious, there were remarkably few signs of forced entry. The screen door was intact, and the only way into the house was through the front door, which George Kelly opened with his own key. The obvious conclusion was that whoever killed the Kellys had entered the home willingly. But why? It soon emerged that George and Catherine were no ordinary couple. They were extremely religious, and did their best to instill good values in their children. In fact, they were known for regularly hosting prayer meetings in their house. Despite their piety, however, George and Catherine weren't exactly pillars of the community. Both of them had rather checkered pasts. Catherine had been married twice before, and her second husband, Henry Bright, had died mysteriously in 1897. Rumors began to circulate that she had poisoned him. Then there was George, who was accused of having had an inappropriate relationship with one of his daughters. Some said that's why he and Catherine had so many children, to try to produce a son and carry on the family name. Others alleged that George had molested his daughter Catherine, and that the other kids were afraid to tell anyone because their father would punish them if they did. With rumors swirling, it seemed clear to many people in town that the killer must have been someone close to the family.
Oh.
But why would someone kill them all? What motive could be great enough to slay an entire family, including a baby? And why did the killer mutilate the bodies? For decades, the mysterious crime remained unsolved. KPO wondered if it was the work of a deranged killer, a crazed cult, Satanists, or vampires. The killings would come to be known as the Axemen of Villisca. And although it might not have been vampires, perhaps there were some satanic elements at play here. Every aspect of this killing was incredibly disturbing. The sheer brutality, the amount of blood, the systematic nature of the slayings, the apparent thrill the killer got from desecrating the bodies. Whatever the motivation, it was something deeply personal. Then in 1912, a man named Brian Brown confessed to the crime. First, investigators thought they had their guy. Brian was a drifter who lived in the area. He had a criminal record and was known to have had an argument with George Kelly. Apparently, the two men couldn't stand each other. Brian admitted to being in the house at the time of the murders, but he insisted he wasn't the killer. He said he had come over to borrow a shotgun from George, but when he knocked on the door, it was opened by one of the older boys. According to Brian, he had gone inside and then heard the sound of an axe hitting flesh. He ran outside and hid in the cornfield next to the house. When he returned the next morning, he found the bodies and immediately called the police. His story checked out. Several witnesses corroborated his alibi. And what's more, Brian had apparently confessed to a friend of his. Under questioning, he repeated his story, insisting he wasn't guilty. And that's when things took a bizarre turn. Brian asked the police if he could look at the bodies and identify the killer himself. They agreed and drove him back to the Kelly residence. He allegedly examined the bodies and then pointed his finger at one of the victims and exclaimed, "God damn him, he did it." It seems as though Brian had tried to frame someone else for the crime. He was released and never charged. For the next 47 years, Brian would travel the country, confessing to the police in different states that he decommitted the Villisca murders, but each time he did so, he gave a different account of what had happened. Sometimes he said he acted alone. There are times he implicated imaginary accomplices. Once he claimed that a woman had helped him. Another time he said he was hired by a secret organization to kill the entire family. Sadly, Brian would never stop blaming someone else for the massacre until his dying day. Thanks for watching. See you next time.